So if you're watching this, you've probably seen my previous videos where I talk about how Adam and Eve did not exist, but rather Adam and Eve represent the nation of Israel. That is why Adam and Eve have so many similarities to Israel. I talk about more of this stuff in my book, Secrets of the Bible from the East. So if you haven't gotten that, go to the link in my profile and get my books. But this video is going to be a video where I dive into the evidence and information a little bit deeper. So before I start this video, I just actually wanted to find what evidence actually is, because I don't want to get to the end of the video and people say that wasn't evidence or you didn't prove anything, because most people don't actually know what evidence actually looks like. Evidence is defined as a body of facts or a available body of data or information, and that data or available body of facts, they lead to a conclusion. So the conclusion of the evidence that I'm going to be showing is that based off of the available evidence, the most logical conclusion is that the Genesis account was not written by Moses, but the Genesis account was written in Babylon. And if you can figure out when the Genesis account was written down, you can actually figure out why the Genesis account was written down. A lot of people believe that Moses wrote the book of Genesis, but people don't actually know why they believe that. A lot of people believe this common tradition, but most people don't know where this tradition actually came from, and they actually don't know the evidence for this position or the lack of evidence thereof. So the first time in history the 5 books of the Old Testament referred to as the Pentateuch or the Torah is ever referred to as the 5 books of Moses is actually in the 1611 King James Bible. Before the 1611 King James Bible, there is no writing or no other indication that Moses wrote the first 5 books of the Torah. Now, you do have in Jewish writings in the first century, people would say that Moses received the law, or that Moses was the author of the law, or the author of the 10 Commandments, which we also refer to as the Decalogue, the 10 sayings. But nobody in the first century actually said that Moses wrote the Torah. There is no Bible verse that explicitly says that Moses wrote the Torah or Moses wrote the Pentateuch. There are Bible verses where Moses writes down specific instructions from God in Exodus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. But other than that, there is no explicit text that says Moses wrote the Torah. So people only believe that Moses wrote the Torah because that is what other people told them, but that is actually not in the Bible. Jesus does say to the Pharisees, if you believed Moses, you would believe me because Moses wrote about me. But Jesus never says Moses wrote the Torah. Jesus says Moses wrote about me. And that could be anything. That could be what Moses wrote in Exodus. That could be what God told Moses to write in Numbers. That could be what Moses wrote in Deuteronomy. But Jesus saying you would have believed what Moses wrote about me is not Jesus saying that Moses wrote the Torah. So we actually read that into the Bible because that is something that we already believe to be true. This is what biblical scholars actually do find when we look into the book of Genesis. So in Genesis chapter 1, you have God creating the heavens and the earth. Pretty simple. We all know about that. But what we don't know is the way how an ancient Israelite view God creating the heavens and the earth is not what we think about today at all. And if you got my books, Secrets of the Bible from the East, which you can get in my profile, I talk about this all throughout the books. This is called Ancient Israelite Cosmology. The Israelites, as well as their neighbors, used to believe that the world was flat. They used to believe that the earth was flat. And over top of this flat earth was water. Now, in the beginning of the world, people in the ancient world, they used to believe that the world or the universe that we know, it came from undifferentiated water. They didn't believe in space. When you think about God creating the world in 2024, you think about God creating space. But an ancient Israelite did not believe in space. They did not know what space was. When an ancient Israelite looked up at the sky, they thought the reason the sky was blue is because there was water up there. So in Genesis 1, when the Bible says that God created the heavens and the earth, and God hovered over the face of the deep or the face of the waters, that is not talking about God hovering over water in the sea. That is talking about God hovering over an ocean that is in the sky. Now, this closely relates to a Babylonian creation story. And this is one of the reasons how we know that Genesis was written while the Israelites were in Babylon. There's a Babylonian creation story, and it predates the Genesis story by thousands of years, called the Enuma Elish. Now, the Enuma Elish is a Babylonian story of creation, and in the Babylonian story of creation, the world starts off from water, just like in Genesis. But in the Enuma Elish, there are two gods, and these two gods, they are formed from the waters. So from the waters of creation, the gods are created. Now, one of the names of those gods is called Tiamat. The other's name is Apsu. Now, in Genesis chapter 1, when God is hovering over the face of the deep, the Hebrew word for deep is tehom. Now, tehom is a cognate. So tehom is a sister word to a sister Babylonian language called Akkadian. And the sister word that is related to tehom is Tiamat, the name of the Babylonian dragon in the Enuma Elish. So your Hebrew Bible is trying to communicate the idea that when the world began, Yahweh was hovering over the face of Tiamat, this Babylonian water dragon in the Enuma Elish. So in the ancient world, people used to believe that their gods, they were created from this chaotic ocean in the sky. Well, when you read the Bible, Yahweh is not created from a cosmic ocean. When you read the Genesis story of creation, Yahweh already exists, and Yahweh is hovering over the waters that the other gods claim to come from. So what the Genesis author is trying to argue is, your gods claim to come from the water, but our God hovers above the waters that your gods claim to come from. All that to say, why is Genesis arguing against Babylonian creation myths? Why is the very first two verses of Genesis Babylonian themed? How come there is a Babylonian cognate in the Genesis account, right in Genesis chapter 1, verse 2? So those are things that have to be accounted for. And the best explanation that accounts for all of this is maybe Genesis 1 is Babylonian themed. Maybe Genesis 1 is arguing against a Babylonian creation story. And maybe the reason why there's a Babylonian cognate in Genesis is because the Israelites wrote Genesis 1 while they were in Babylonian captivity from 596 BC to 538 BC. So how do we know the Adam and Eve story has Babylonian origins? We talked about Genesis 1, so now let's talk about Genesis chapter 2. So Genesis 2 is actually related to a few Babylonian, Sumerian creation myths. And one creation myth that Genesis is similar to is the Mesopotamian story of Adapa. The legend of Adapa is about Adapa, and Adapa is the first man who's made by the god E. Adapa has incredible intelligence and wisdom, and one day he decides to go fishing. And there's a problem where the winds begin beating on Adapa and his boat, and so Adapa breaks the south wind. Apparently these people believed the wind was something that you could grab, the wind was something that you could possess, the wind was something that was physical and tangible. So Adapa breaks the south winds, and so the god Anu summons Adapa into heavenly court, and he has to go to heavenly court with the gods for 7 days. So he has to go into the heavenly realm with the gods for 7 days, and he's on trial. And Adapa's patron deity, the god who made Adapa, he tells Adapa not to accept the bread of life and the water of life. So in ancient mythos, you have this consistent theme of food of the gods and drinks of the gods. So E tells Adapa not to eat from the bread of life or the water of life. So Adapa goes into the heavenly court, and the god Anu is so impressed with Adapa's wisdom, he offers Adapa the bread of life and the water of life, and Adapa refuses. And as a result of Adapa's refusal to partake in these divine foods, he goes back to earth and he remains mortal. And so from the Babylonian point of view, that is their explanation for why humanity is mortal, because their Babylonian primordial or primeval person did not accept the bread of life or the water of life. You have this theme of the first man, and he's with the gods for 7 days, and he's offered a choice between choosing between the bread of life and the water of life, just like Adam and Eve are given a choice between the tree of knowledge of good and evil or the tree of life. The tree of knowledge of good and evil represent death, and the tree of life represents life. Adam and Eve, they are in a heavenly realm with God. They're walking with God in the cool of the garden. God creates the world in 6 days, and he rests on the seventh, but technically God makes the world in a 7-day period. Now, if you notice in the story, the god E, he actually deceives Adapa and tells Adapa not to eat from the bread of life and the waters of life, because E is afraid that if Adapa, he receives this divine food, Adapa is going to be like the gods. And you actually have in the Genesis story, the humans actually do partake in a type of divine food. And Yahweh in the story says, the man has become like us. So in the story of Adapa, Adapa doesn't partake of any divine food. And in the story of Adam and Eve actually partake in divine food, and they become like the gods, or they become like Yahweh. But wait, there's actually more. So there's more evidence that the Adam and Eve story is Babylonian. So you also have the story of the Epic of Gilgamesh. So the story of the Epic of Gilgamesh is about a demigod named Gilgamesh. And Gilgamesh is a king, but he's not a complete god. He's not immortal. So Gilgamesh goes on a quest so he can find out the secret to living forever and becoming a god. And so the gods, in order to stop Gilgamesh from his quest, the gods create a man out of clay named Enkidu. Now, Enkidu is a wild man. And so what the gods decide to do is they make a woman come to Enkidu so he can be brought into civilization, so that he can become civil. And in 7 days, this man who is made from clay, the gods bring this woman to his side, and this woman civilizes Enkidu so he can come into civilization. And the Epic of Gilgamesh is a Sumerian epic. It is a Babylonian Sumerian creation mythos. And it's similar to the story of Adam and Eve, where God creates Adam from clay, just like Enkidu is made from clay. Enkidu has a woman brought to him by the gods, and the woman is brought to his side or to his location. In the Adam and Eve story, God creates Eve from Adam's side, and in a way, Eve civilizes Adam to a certain degree. God says it is not good for man to be alone. So Eve, she brings completeness and wholeness to Adam the same way how the woman who comes to Enkidu, she brings completeness and wholeness, and she makes Enkidu civilized. She civilizes Enkidu over a period of 7 days. In the Genesis creation story, God creates the world in 7 days. So then the Adam and Eve narrative is then made to retell the story about Israel's fall from grace, about how when Israel went into the land of Canaan, they disobeyed God, they chose evil instead of good, and they were exiled, and they were exiled from the land of Israel. Adam and Eve. Adam is made from dirt in the same way that God forms the nation of Israel while they were in a land filled with dirt. God forms the nation of Israel while they are in the wilderness. God, in the Adam and Eve narrative, forms Adam from the dust of the ground. God places Adam in the Garden of Eden. God places the Israelites in the land of Canaan. God tells Adam not to eat from the tree of knowledge of good and evil, lest he will die. In Deuteronomy chapter 30, verse 15, this was written hundreds of years before Genesis chapter 2 was even written down. In Deuteronomy 30, God says, I put before you life and death, good and evil. When you go into the land, if you worship any other gods besides me, you will surely die. Well, when the Israelites go into the land of Canaan, they worship another deity. And when Adam goes into the land of Eden, by obeying the serpent in the garden, Adam worships the serpent, or he worships the deity, and he partakes in the forbidden fruit. Well, when God told Israel to choose life or choose death, don't worship any other gods, that is the forbidden fruit the Israelite partook in. The forbidden fruit in Genesis chapter 3 is the sins of the Israelites that they really went through in walking life. The person who's writing the Genesis account is looking back at the Israelites' real history while they're in Babylonian captivity, and they're retelling the history of Israel using myths, using archetype, using symbols of creation, so they can retell the real history of Israel using meta-narrative and symbolism. The Genesis creation account is a Babylonian Israelite retelling of what happened in the land of Israel and why the Israelites fell from grace and why they lost their relationship with God. What's happened is hundreds of years have went on and the meaning of the story has evolved. So by the time that we look at the same story today, an ancient Israelite can't even recognize the story anymore because we've taken the story that was originally about Israel and we've made it about ourselves. And in case you're wondering, there are notable scholars who actually hold to this position. I didn't make this position up. Notable scholars such as Julius Wellhausen. If you know the name Julius Wellhausen, you might recognize it because Julius Wellhausen is the guy who created the documentary hypothesis in 1848. You guys might recognize it as JEPD. Another notable scholar who holds to Adam being Israel is P. Enns. Another biblical scholar is Seth Postel. And another biblical scholar, Walter Brueggemann. I always forget his name. This is actually a pretty common view in biblical scholarship. Most biblical scholars actually hold to this position. This is actually not anything that's new at all. People have known about this since the 1800s, so for about 200 years. Why you guys are just not learning about this, I have no idea. But if you want to know more about this stuff, if you want to know answers to questions like, well, if Cain and Abel did not literally exist, because Cain and Abel can't exist if their parents didn't exist, then what is the Cain and Abel story really about? If you have questions like, who is the serpent in the garden? Because the serpent in the garden is not the devil. If you have questions like, what about the genealogies in Genesis? And if you have questions like, well, how can we tell what's historical and what's mythos? You need to get my books, Secrets of the Bible from the East. The discount code, while it's still working today, is secret. But if you want to know more about this stuff, go to the link in my YouTube profile. Get my book, Secrets of the Bible from the East. If you really want to know what your Bible actually means, this is not going to take away from your faith. This is going to build your faith. My name is Wayne. Welcome to Secrets of the Bible. And with that being said, until next time, good luck, good night. And you can believe that Adam and Eve did not exist and still be a Christian.